policy advisor. She's previously worked as a senior legislative aide with the Nigerian Senate and has consulted with multiple think tanks across Africa. Good evening and welcome, Ms. Tayo, to the conversation.
Good evening, Nabila. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on. So I want us to start the conversation with the state of the economy, right? And I'm just going to reel out a few things. So PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, recently noted that revenue performance has often been below 70%, right? And expenditure has been somewhere around 85%, and this is looking at historical data. The non-oil sector has seen some sort of improvement, but it continues to lag behind oil sector in terms of FX inflows. And this is part of what has driven the administration to take on some of the reforms that it has. Yet, a few of the gains that they thought they would get by the end of 2023 have yet to materialize. Perhaps one of the more important ones we saw was FAC allocation, essentially increase across the board. So let's start there, right? What is going wrong, and what are the immediate changes we need to look at to pivot, to change our expected outcome?
Thank you for the question. So there are two parts to it. You know, how much are we earning and how are we spending? How much are we spending also, and how are we spending what we're spending? And when you talk about what Nigeria is earning as a nation, as a country, first of all, government revenue anywhere you go in the world is driven by taxes. So whether it's taxes on the oil sector, like you mentioned, or on the non-oil sector, or whether it's just taxes on general economic activity within the country. And the fact is that, in general, there's been a slump in that activity. So some things that even happened last year before the current administration came in led to a further decline in consumption or in economic activity. So when people are not buying and selling or producing, then you have much less revenue as a government. So you asked the question, what are some of the things that we can do to make things better? Yes, there were two key reforms last year. There was the removal of the petrol subsidy, which was important. A lot of us had been asking for it. But then there was a question of how do you really go about it, and what do you do afterwards? So what do you do with the revenue gains that you record from the removal of the subsidy? And how do you make sure that what you spend those gains on can ensure that you have money for the future, whether it's for Nigerians in terms of public services, or whether it's for infrastructure? And I think that's where we're missing things a little bit. As you remember, in the past couple of years, we've been spending a lot of money on infrastructure. But infrastructure is good, yes, always good. But in Africa, for example, there's a very steep infrastructure deficit. So we do not have enough money to build all of the infrastructure that we want. So what it means is that you need to prioritize infrastructure and figure out which ones will yield returns in the near term. And I'm not sure we have done that as much as we ought to, given the scarcity of resources. So that's on one side, which is how to spend, right? And how to spend more effectively or efficiently for the future. But then when it comes to earnings, there's a tax question. And people like to say that Nigeria's tax to GDP is one of the lowest, not even just in the world, even in Africa. And that is true. But then those are for the official taxes. Nigerians are taxed informally in many different directions. In fact, there's some research that says that if we were just to harmonize our taxation or the taxes, there will be more gains than even trying to expand the tax bracket. And there's also the fact that for you to effectively tax your people, they need to be able to trust that you're going to use those taxes effectively. There's a question about the social contract and just extraction. The more money you take from the citizens, the more they expect you to deliver some particular public goods. But I think that there's some opportunity there still even. You mentioned the non-oil sector. And one of the sectors that has been performing incredibly so far is the services sector. So the digital economy is growing very quickly, and nowadays you really see a lot of growth there compared to other sectors. But has that really translated to wider benefits for Nigerians? Because we have typically very few players in that sector. And when you talk about the digital economy, it's mostly the more educated Nigerians living in cities. They are the ones that are programmers, that are software developers, that are engineers. So they are the ones that are able to export their services. They are the ones that are developing the fintech apps. But that doesn't really spread across the country. So I think we need to get better at and this may not sound very nice, but then finding a way to redistribute some of the wealth that is being generated by that sector to other parts of the country, and not in terms of welfare, but just in terms of investments that can mean that other people are able to participate in that sector. There's some policies that are in that direction already. So there's a National Talent Export Program that has been launched by the federal government, trying to get more Nigerians in the services sector. And I know the Federal Ministry for Communications, Innovations, and the Digital Economy, it's a mouthful, also have like 3 million tech jobs trying to get more Nigerians, or they're trying to build capacity to get them exporting services. But yes, those sectors that seem very promising, we need to invest more in them, but also see how they can benefit a wider, basket of Nigerians. But we also need to figure out spending, because we don't have money. And this is a problem across the world, right? A lot of governments are facing fiscal stress, where they have more demands and more obligations than the revenue that they're able to raise. So you have to be very targeted. You have to prioritize, and you really need to know your numbers to know where do you need to put 1 billion naira into that would generate more returns, whether in terms of human capacity or whether just in terms of expansion of economic activity in the near term. Yeah.
So you've said a couple of things that certainly stick out for me. On one hand, you talk about wealth distribution. On the other hand, when you were talking about infrastructure and what government has been trying to do, the revenue conversation, expenditure conversation, it makes me curious about where the subnational government comes in, because much of the focus is on the center. When you talk about whether it's jobs, whatever the projects are, and yet some people argue that unemployment is actually a state problem and not the federal government's problem. There's only so much the federal can do. So I wonder where the states come in and what you've seen in terms of just posturing, especially recently, and trying to bridge the gap.
Yeah. So I like to remind people that there is no Nigeria outside of the states, because there is no entity called Nigeria beyond the states. So everything that's happening in Nigeria is happening in one state or the other. So whether it's unemployment, whether it's insecurity, it's happening in one state or the other, and there is sort of like a line of responsibility. You're very right that state governments have a better grasp of what is going on within their territories, or when it even gets down to it, because we're already talking about the regional disparities in Nigeria. So the federal government may not have a good understanding, to an extent, they have some understanding, but then a good understanding of what is going on in maybe rural parts of Zamfara State. Well, the Zamfara State governor ought to actually have that information. So you're very right that that burden of responsibility is at the state level, but I think we've excused the state governors for a while now, where there's not as much demand on them in terms of some of these development schemes or development issues. And they have the reasons that they give. They say, for example, when FAC allocations were very low, and then they were trying to explain that they were not able to do much with what they were getting. But then the fact is that there's lots of opportunity for them, really. But I think at the end of the day, it's not about whether it's either the federal or the state or the local government. It's just supposed to be about close collaboration and coordination across these different levels of government, where information is flowing in both directions, resources even flowing in both directions, all to try to improve the welfare of Nigerians as much as we can. Yeah.
So we will come back to the conversation in just a moment. We take a quick break, and Pivot will continue shortly after.
Every second and every minute, something new happens.
The Nigerian National Hotel.
The news.
Triple at a spot, and angry mobs decided to bomb.
Everyone wants to share it, but not everyone wants to dig deep. Now that's where we come in. We bring you the news and go beyond with in-depth conversations and analysis with stakeholders.
I honestly think that the federal government on its own part has...
We bring you the story within the story, and that's what makes us tick. We are Radio Now 95.3 FM Lagos, and we go beyond the news.
Many believe life as we know it has changed irrevocably, and that in this seismic shift lies an opportunity to turn things around, improve our country, and make life better for the majority. It is time to reboot Nigeria. Daria Media, with the support of the MacArthur Foundation, presents Pivotal. Join me, Nabila Usman, as I sit with policymakers.
Kanga's town itself has less than 10 policemen. How will it work?
Civil society.
What needs to be done to reform the police is known.
Industry players and individual Nigerians implementing unconventional ideas that have the power to change our country for the better. Catch Pivotal every last Wednesday of the month from 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. on AIT.
Welcome back. It's still Pivotal. And my name's Nabila Usman. My guests this evening are Teniola Tayo, a trade and development policy advisor who's been discussing the Nigerian economy with me. But joining us is Dr. Tokwe Fashoa, with a PhD in public policy, a renowned economist, public affairs analyst, and also the special advisor to the president on economic affairs. Welcome to the conversation, Dr. Fashoa.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me.
Good to have you on. So just before we went off on a break, we were discussing one of the points that came up was wealth distribution in the country. And very interesting that data tells us, when we look at the Gini coefficient, that as of right now, post-military rule, Nigeria's wealth distribution is actually performing way better. It's not a surprise to many experts because of what military rule is like. However, we've averaged somewhere between 31 and 35%. The wealth continues to stay within a certain subset. What are we doing wrong?
Well, thank you very much for bringing that topic back to the front burner. And, well, you know, the problem is, I think, when countries are faced with sometimes existential issues, sometimes global cataclysms, you know, some of those kind of discussions kind of take the back, you know, sort of the back seat, you know. But it's always important to bring it back on, because whatever it is you achieve in terms of income growth, GDP growth, and what have you in a country, you also have to look at the distribution. And whereas Nigeria is not the most unequal country in Africa, I think South Africa is way more unequal. I was discussing Ghana with someone today. We didn't quite agree as to which was more unequal between Nigeria and some of those countries. I think I'll probably put that down to the fact that Nigerians are very aspirational. You know, like they will say on the street, we don't agree for anybody. So every Nigerian believes he can be a millionaire, a billionaire. And so there's that constant aspiration. But also it needs to be checked, because there are times when no matter what you do, no matter how people try, they just can't break that barrier. And so it's very important. However, the challenge we are facing right now is, how do we get growth back into the economy? How do we, you know, post-COVID and all of that, you know, how do we get growth back? When I hear predictions for Nigeria at 3%, I'm sad, you know, and I'm thinking, what can we do to break those predictions? You know, we need to be growing at a lot faster than that. And as we're growing a lot faster, we need also to begin to think about distribution of income beyond handing out palliatives. What I see here is, I always say that Nigerian economy hasn't quite started. You know, we're not talking about giving out palliatives to people. We're saying that opportunities are there. I mean, I heard Teniola, right? You know, Teniola, I heard her speaking about, you know, the opportunities that are bound, our infrastructure deficits and all of that. For me, that's work to be done, you know, all over the country. Beyond even the talk about diversification of economies, what they call spatial diversification. I mean, I was in Kano a couple of days back. I saw what was happening. There's a buzz going on in Kano, whether anybody likes it or not. You know, I mean, it's always expanding. I went to a few industries. I saw that these people are unstoppable, you know, in terms of what they're doing. But can we get that also replicated in most of the states as well, so that people say, and I believe perhaps it's so, and I pray it continues to be so, that you would not find a lot of maybe some terrorist attacks in Kano, because everybody's busy. I mean, many of these industries, you know, employing tens of thousands of laborers, carrying stuff and all of that. So we need to think about that at some point. And I think one of the ways, beyond distributing money on the streets or, the now rested cash transfer program, which I'm sorry, I wasn't quite a fan of, because I think, those things are too open to all sorts of loopholes in terms of what could go on there. Beyond that, I think infrastructural development will help in bridging the income gap, because after food, a bit of shelter, a bit of clothing, people want to move around. Transport comes in, So how easily and how cheaply can people move around and try to reposition themselves, see their families, get happy, and all of those things. So infrastructure development, how many schools are there, how many teachers are there, so that even someone who doesn't have a lot of money can send their children to school, and that child's trajectory begins to take a different, a different kind of hue from their parents and all of that. That's how I believe income can be better distributed. Now, there's also this big discussion about NLC, Labour Congress, and their clamor for more income for their people, which is great, and of course, if you look at the very profound reforms that the government has taken, for example, removal of oil subsidies and the bridging of the gap between the two forex rates in the country, these are very profound reforms, which conforms with what, for example, donors and lenders want us to do. But they are also very painful reforms. So the question now comes up: how do we break the gap? How do we ensure that that people actually have more money? The NLC can only speak for a fraction of 12% of workers in Nigeria. 88% of workers in Nigeria, according to the MBS, work for themselves. They work in a structured environment, meaning that, people go out, you hear them say, I'm going out to hustle. So it's either you're hustling, or you're a farmer, or you're a laborer, or you're doing something on your own. So, and then out of the remaining 12% in structured employment, perhaps maybe 70% don't belong in unions. So the question now becomes, fine, I don't want us to be sidelined with the discussion of higher income being demanded by the NLC. I know you won't be sidelined by that, because it takes care of only a small fraction of society. So now, let me just land with this.
I want to expand a bit more on one of the points you raised. Right. I'm glad that you raised diversification, and you've spoken about it in twofold: economic diversification and spatial diversification. Right. I find it interesting because every time we have these conversations, they're still very urban-centric.
Exactly.
And part of what we're seeing coming to bite us, if you like, in the behind, is years of neglect of rural development.
Absolutely.
Neglect of the income of people in those areas. And we're seeing it across the board. It's not just their inability to feed, it's around security, it's around the protection of generational growth, whatever the case may be. So let's talk about that. Right? When you mention spatial diversification, how do we bridge that gap?
I've always insisted, the next spike of growth, for Nigeria, for the economy, would actually come from the rural areas. However, like you noticed, for too long we've neglected those people. And I was going to make a point earlier about the fact that in government now we're trying to think even for the artisans who have no voice, who don't belong to any union, who work for you, and you say, what's your fee? And they say, just give me anything you like. And these guys are living constantly on the edge, and just takes one sickness and they're out. And so we want to have a much more multi-sectoral and multidimensional thinking about this issue of inequality, to say, okay, whereas we're trying to take care of people who belong in unions under the NLC, but what about those guys who don't belong in the union? There's 88% of people who are struggling on their own. And of course, you see, it's a big shame that over time, we seem to have neglected the rural areas. We fly over them. It used to be that in time, before, when you were traveling from Abuja to Lagos, you have to go by road, you have to stop in Lokoja and have a meal. Sometimes you decide to sleep over in Lokoja and continue the next day. That means you're paying the hotel. You move forward, maybe you get to Benin, you decide to take another meal. Now, all of those economies have been neglected because, well, technologically, we're much more able to fly above them. And of course, as some of these security issues came up, which, like you rightly ascribed, could also be as a result of the neglect in part we cannot walk away from the fact that sometimes the neglect of the rural areas and the people living in those places may have led to a scenario where a few elements in those places believe that, look, we need to get back as society one way or the other. I mean, there'll be other issues also involved. There's also politics involved, it must be said. Sometimes the way some of those things come up sporadically, you probably would ask yourself, there's a pattern. Like, someone trying to say, hey, we're here and government must listen to what we have to say. Now, that's for the government and the security services to deal with, but it is clear that now we need to pay a lot more attention to the rural area, and the concept of spatial diversification is key to say that, whereas in the states, for example, in many of the states of Nigeria, only the capital thrives. And that's because the governor is there, sitting down there, everybody wants to see the governor, you have to be a government contractor for you to be someone and to be somebody. But hey, now is the time. If we were pursuing growth the way we need to in terms of double-digit growth that we need, because if our population is growing at 2.6%, we need to do a whole lot more. If we could get some of this infrastructure we're talking about going, then that means that we need to be actually tending towards that double-digit growth. Where will it come from? Is it much more urbanization? Some people believe in urbanization, I must say. It's not like former Governor El-Rufai will tell you that everywhere needs to be more a city eventually. But then again, let's look at it. There's opportunity for us to say, for example, if we got our rail sector going and people could travel by rail from, now people actually do travel by rail from Ibadan to Lagos, and they work in Lagos and they find a way of going back to Ibadan every day. You catch the train at 4:30 or 5 o'clock, you're back in Ibadan at 8, and we need, and so you see, I mean, there's every opportunity for us. We haven't quite started. If only we could continue to drive the dream and keep repeating the power of repetition, and I think we get something going.
I'm going to piggyback off that and come to you, Ms. Tayo. And let's expand a little more on that economic diversification, especially when we look at that also incorporating spatial diversification. When we bring the rural areas up, one of the sectors we discuss quite a bit is agriculture. If you talk about diversification, you also talk about mineral extraction. And yet we come back to the fact that the impact, the gains don't seem to be spreading across the board. So how do we manage that?
Thank you. So the first thing is that the Nigerian economy is already somewhat diversified, right? So one of the things that is not really diversified is what we export to the world. That's where you have oil and gas taking about 90% of our exports. But in terms of domestic economic activity, there's a lot going on, and oil actually plays a smaller part compared to the other sectors. But for agriculture and mining that you mentioned, it's not just about diversifying, but also going up the value chain. Because a lot of the agriculture that we practice at the moment in Nigeria, especially in rural areas, is at the subsistence level. So it means that people have small farms where they produce small amounts of goods. They try to sell them to their own local markets, which then try to sell them to regional markets, try to get them to cities. And there's a lot of gaps there. Because, for example, a lot of spoilage of goods, of food, of the perishable foods. And also there are lots of taxes that block food products from coming from the rural areas to the cities within their states, and even to the bigger urban cities where they can get more value for it. But even beyond all of that, there's the fact that we ought to be processing a lot more of our food products. So instead of selling raw cashew nuts, what about cashew paste that can be used as a dairy alternative for some foods? Or instead of selling raw cassava or garri, there's all sorts of value-added things that can come out of that. What that means is that you get a lot more income for selling those things versus the raw materials, or just when you have 1 or 2 levels of value addition. So it's diversifying, yes, but also going up the value chain. And what does that look like for rural parts of Nigeria? It really means meeting people where they are. And that's the great thing about manufacturing or hardcore manufacturing. When you want to start a factory, when you want to start sort of like a line, a production line in a factory, the level of skills development that you need to get someone to participate in that is not too high. It's not as much as trying to get them to code Python, right? So together, letting them know, okay, you take this one and you put it in here and then it goes here. So where you have a factory line. So that's often an opportunity for wide-scale employment generation in rural areas, because the idea is that you can train people in rural areas, even with very little education, to work in factories within a couple of months. But of course, it's not just about working in factories, because something that I learned not so long ago, from the theory, it says, you need to build factories to create jobs. But then sometime on Twitter, Nigerians were talking about their experience working in factories, and they were talking about high levels of exploitation. People were talking about earning, 3,000 naira, even I think less, maybe 1,000 naira a day working in a factory. So yes, using that as an avenue for wide-scale employment generation, but then within reason, so with labor rights as very important. The other question you asked about mining. Mining is very key, and the way the world is changing now, mining may become a little bit, actually more important in many areas, because for some of the new technologies, some of the renewable technologies, we need some of these products, right? And it's again about value addition, because if you sell the raw versions of those products, to countries like China, which now has, most of about 60 to 70% of the global processing capacity for a lot of these renewable energy materials, you're not getting a lot of value for your people. So it's about value addition and figuring out what that looks like. I remember reading that they tried to do that with Tesla, telling him, unconfirmed reports, that they were not going to sell the raw materials for batteries to him, but then he had to come and set up a manufacturing plant. Yes, you can make statements like that, but then it has to be within an ecosystem of an environment that can actually allow such factories to thrive, and also to make sure that you already have a pipeline of skills of people that can actually work in those areas. So that's what I can say about those two sectors.
So we'll pick up the conversation in a few moments. We're going to take a quick break, and when we return, Pivotal continues.
Every second and every minute, something new happens.
The Nigerian National Hotel.
The news.
And angry mobs decided to bomb.
Everyone wants to share it, but not everyone wants to dig deep. Now that's where we come in. We bring you the news and go beyond with in-depth conversations and analysis with stakeholders.
I honestly think that the federal government on its own part has...
We bring you the story within the story, and that's what makes us tick. We are Radio Now 95.3 FM Lagos, and we go beyond the news.
Join us.
Many believe life as we know it has changed irrevocably, and that in this seismic shift lies an opportunity to turn things around, improve our country, and make life better for the majority. It is time to reboot Nigeria. Daria Media, with the support of the MacArthur Foundation, presents Pivotal. Join me, Nabila Usman, as I sit with policymakers.
Federal town itself has less than 10 policemen. How will it work?
Civil society.
What needs to be done to reform the police is known.
Industry players and individual Nigerians implementing unconventional ideas that have the power to change our country for the better. Catch Pivotal every last Wednesday of the month from 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. on AIT.
Welcome back. This is Pivotal. My name is Nabila Usman, and on this month's edition, we're discussing the economy. My guests are Teniola Tayo, a trade and development policy advisor, expert. She's also someone who's worked with think tanks across Africa. I also have Dr. Tokwe Fashua with a PhD in public policy and economist and a special advisor to the president on economic affairs. On this edition of Pivotal, we also happen to have with us in the studio an audience. They will be participating in today's conversation with questions and contributions. So we'll turn to the audience to get your thoughts.
My name is Ene Ede of Equity Advocates. I also work with a Doka Trauma Center, Doka Trauma Care Center. Doctor, because of your background, your very rich background, I'm interested in understanding what your office and the government is doing to address the reality of the trauma that Nigerians are going through. A while ago, we had a convening on listening to respond to have a collective action on trauma care in Nigeria, and many of the Nigerians, they couldn't come, and even online they were not able to connect. For a few, they say, look, they are going through trauma, so trauma is on the lips of a lot of people, and resolving trauma is very essential for you to be able to get patriotic citizens as well as citizens that are coordinated in terms of their well-being. Thank you.
So, Dr. Fashaw will come to you with a response, and then we'll return to our audience.
Right. If I got the question right, she asked about what's the government doing for Nigerians who are maybe suffering trauma or, recovering from traumatic situations. And, initially I was going to speak about, the fact that, like what I mentioned earlier, that we're trying to have a much more broader outlook to the response to the people. And that's when I spoke about NLC versus those multitude of people that are out there that have no voice, Indeed, a lot of things could traumatize Nigerians, apart from the good old poverty. We have people suffering different sort of trauma from security issues around the country. We hear about a new spate of kidnapping, which you'd wonder, why is this coming up and all of that. Now, so the response to trauma will be multifaceted as well. There needs to be, the fact that counseling, even medical care, especially for people. Now, I would probably not say, because I'm not a health professional, for example, that the level of care for PTSD, for example, for people who have PTSD, coming from any angle, indeed, is at par in Nigeria. Probably is not. Chances are that is not. But it's also an ongoing discussion and debate, and that is the essence of government itself. The reason why governments are there is to ensure that the lives of the people are better. Perhaps the more we're able to get the standard of living up, the better things like trauma will be taken care of, sometimes naturally, or sometimes as a result of the infrastructure that we have put in place.
Perhaps there's a question around whether government actually recognizes trauma as an impediment, and to what extent the conversation is being had in Nigeria, driven by Nigerian realities, as opposed to an external conversation that we import.
Chances are that, programs like yours and the question that the lady has asked, those are the things that elevate the discussion. That's why I'm here today. As someone who's serving in government, and I'm not afraid to say, let me come and take whatever questions may come, all of these discussions must make it to the table. So to a large extent, I said to you that, look, if we would judge by the reputation of maybe Nigeria health care, or even maybe governance up until now, we can actually judge right here, right now, and say, okay, maybe nobody is actually speaking to those people. I've seen people who've been through kidnapping issues and nobody cares afterwards what happens to them. Nobody is calling them. But I've also seen scenario. We have a coordinating minister in the health industry, Dr. Ali Pate, Professor Pate. One of the best you could get in the world, indeed. And he understands this issue. And this is a man, we had a retreat the other time, and the kind of thinking, I could see someone who understands the entire ramification of healthcare, including psychological issues and what have you, And so, look, let's keep talking about these issues. Okay, but the first thing is this, that society must grow the economy, ensure a certain bridging of this inequality gap, so that we don't have all those kind of spikes in violence and things that traumatize our people. If we could ensure that there's a reduction in poverty levels, that we could build infrastructure the more, then, and of course the governance And you can see that these days, because of technology, governance has become a lot more difficult. Because whenever it is you're trying to hide, you realize that you can't hide anything. You have to push it up. Look at what happened with the guys in the cash transfer thing. You know what I'm saying?
So we'll take another question, and I do take your point. I hear you clearly, especially in your reference to the coordinating Minister of Social Welfare and Minister of Health. And perhaps there is a conversation to be had around institutionalizing that understanding. Right? So let's take another question from the audience, and then the conversation continues. Just go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Abdullah Ali Usman. I am the National President, Joint National Association of Persons with Disability. My question also goes to the doctor, the special advisor on economic affairs. Sir, my question is on the wealth scheme creation. I want to know how your government is serious about this scheme on persons with disability. You know, sir, the person with disability is the most vulnerable group. They are also the marginalized group. So whenever the government is doing any scheme, any program, many times our colleagues, person with non-disability, will always take the advantage of the program. So I want to know how serious is this government specifically on this project for person with disability? Thank you, Doctor.
All right, so let's take that question first. Dr. Fashola.
Right. I think the much I could say about that is that I believe that there's a special assistant or advisor or senior special assistant to the president on the issue of disabilities first of all, it's representation. And in fact, these days, I think many times the disabled people, I don't know whether that's the right word to use, or physically challenged.
People with disabilities.
Physically challenged. Sometimes they are more able than many of us who are walking around and all of that stuff, because they make sure that their voices are heard, and you can't hold them down. And to the extent that the president has had to appoint someone in that, however, that's not enough. So the issue now is this, the government is a bit young, even though I understand that time waits for no man. Well, 8 months into the government, and people want to begin to see results, I would want to encourage people living with disabilities, PWDs, to continue to speak up and ensure that nobody actually shoves them aside, one. Also to ensure there's equity even among them. We need to continue to populate this category, this demographic amongst us, because abroad, where we are copying many of these governance from, they hold them in very high regard, and they are some of the most productive members of society, even on the job. So, of course, it's not about being dependent on government. It's about saying, listen, we have something to offer. We have the brains. We have the ability sometimes, And even when you look at Olympics, many times, PWDs, they get a lot more medals for Nigeria than able-bodied people. So it's an ongoing discussion. It's an ongoing, the SSA in charge, who also maybe is herself or, a PWD, must be taxed by our colleagues to say, okay, what are you bringing for us? How are you repositioning us? Not to say, how much money are you giving us from government, but to say, how many opportunities are you opening up for us? How are our issues taking the front burner? Because again, we've seen in this country that many times people who have ability, usually middle-aged men like me, who are close to politics, they tend to elbow everybody off. And that's whether you're a woman, whether you're a youth, whether you're PWD, they tend to easily elbow everybody and take over the space. But again, we live in a world driven by technology. Everybody should rely on technology and state their case. And I believe that life will be a lot better as we go along. We're not there yet, clearly, but life will get a lot better for everybody, including PWDs, as we go along and adopt the best practices in governance around the world. For example, let me land with saying that if you look at a place like UK, and you're used to the underground train system, you will see that more and more they're putting in, you see the signage that most of the stations now have a scenario where a disabled person can come out, there are lifts you can use without having to be helped. Because what we realize is that they don't want to be carried around. They want to be able to move on their own like normal people.
I mean, it's
and that's the whole idea. And we have to, exactly.
That makes room
Yes.
for other identities within a society. And I couldn't help but overhear Ms. Tyre agreeing with some of the points that Dr. Fashaw is making. I want you to contribute before we turn back to the audience for another question. So just your thoughts on listening to what has been said so far.
Well, I think that's one very easy way the government can demonstrate or signal that they're interested in working with people with disabilities is to make sure that our public services, so the ministries, the agencies, the parastatals are accessible in the different ways that they need to be. So whether it's about mobility or whether it's even about just using the services. So when you go on a ministry's website, if you do not have vision, can you use it? Just I think today I saw someone post about how he cannot use his bank apps because he is blind, and it's a very sensitive information to have to share with someone else, your passwords. Even using an ATM machine for him was very difficult. Imagine having to share your PIN and your card with people. So at that very basic level, because, that's one way the government can start. Yes, the government has to start though, because if the government starts and they start to reform these agencies that we have physically and also in terms of the processes, then other people can follow. There's an act, and I think everyone is aware of the Disability Act that was passed. But then the next step is implementation and even meeting those targets that have been set. So that is what I can say on that issue.
I mean, I will plug in here that it's worth saying that that bill was signed into law after a dire media conversation that put it to then President Muhammadu Buhari. It was a bill that was sitting on his desk for quite some time, and it was raised and shortly signed after. So perhaps these are the conversations that we should be having. So let's return to the audience and get more contributions. Just go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Awal Rafsanjani from CISLAC, Transparency International, Nigeria. We all know that the Nigerian economy is a rentier, it's a parasite economy that encourages consumption. And because of that, it has become extremely difficult, especially at the sub-national level, to get, governors to be more creative and be productive to generate the necessary resources that are needed for development. Secondly, we all see how much government at federal and the state always run to go and take loan. And this loan, despite the fact that we have fiscal responsibility law that clearly spells out how loans should be collected, this loan ended up in a different mission. Thirdly, because of the corruption in the system, the ease of doing business is absolutely not being imposed, despite the fact that previously there was commitment for the ease of doing business. Now, if you look at the number of companies, both multinational companies and the local companies that are running away because of corruption, because of the poor infrastructure, there's no way you can actually have a vibrant economy. Because if you put all these together, there's no way the economy can actually grow and you can actually have wealth that can be distributed and that can encourage the necessary development. Lastly, if you look at the taxes that are not being collected, the NAT report, for example, clearly show how much money that are supposed to be given as a tax by the oil company, they are not paying, and nobody is forcing them to do that. Closely related to that, if you see how some government officials are using their position to give out tax waiver, tax holiday, money that should have been used for development, some people, because they have interest in some of those companies, whether local or international companies, they would give tax waiver for 5 years with the view that they are going to complement and support the economy, and with the view that they are supposed to contribute to corporate social responsibility. Nobody is measuring or monitoring this so-called social corporate responsibility. There's no way any economy can actually rise up and defeat poverty that we are facing. So I want the honorable advisor to respond to how government is actually helping to galvanize this, especially cultivating and motivating, state to be more creative, more innovative in terms of generating revenue, rather than waiting for every month to come to Abuja and collect, allocation, and that's the end of it.
Thank you. So let's come back to the conversation. Dr. Fasha, I'll let you respond very quickly because I'd still like to get final thoughts from you as we begin to wrap up the conversation.
Right. So the question is around waivers, around inefficiencies in government, around inability of maybe some subnationals to think for themselves and generate revenue to run their states, if you like. What I think I could speak about there is that I think if this government is a different kettle of fish, even though we've taken some very, very hard decisions, which of course need to be managed in terms of the impact on the people and especially the most vulnerable people. I'll tell you that for free. That's very important. All these issues of the Naira, where it is right now, but what that does, the Naira, where it is right now, also has some advantages because all of a sudden, in fact, the money that the states are getting, according to Mr. Rafsanjani, has now increased. So now the issue then becomes, what are they doing with it? And I think I heard Teniola say something of that sort when I was still outside. Like, what are they doing with it? Are they paying contractors that they've been owing for years? Are they clearing the wages of their workers? Are they paying the pensioners? First and foremost, are they building new infrastructure? Because all of a sudden they have an arbitrage advantage. Because all of a sudden, for contracts that have high local content, they can do a whole lot more. You can do roads, for example. Sand may have increased, but maybe not at the same pace as the Naira has crashed. Cement is there, and every stuff you need, bitumen, a lot of this can be sourced locally, including the labor, which is, so now we have to push them now. Remember, though, that because we live in a democracy, there's a limit to which the president can dictate to them. However, we can put them under subtle pressure, and I think the press is important. CSOs are very important in putting them under pressure to say, the advantage we have right now is that we can have a boom in infrastructural development in this country. Even if we focus on roads alone, in the next 1 year or 2 or 1.5 years, we can have roads all over Nigeria as a result of this, because we're getting more Naira for every dollar. So whether we're talking about receipts from MPA or NIMASA, which are in dollars, or of course the crude oil sales, which we're still lucky. Crude oil, the last time I checked, Brent crude was selling for about $82. So we've been very lucky in that regard. So everybody has a duty to continue to, that's what's called governance. The governance is not just what's done by politicians, it's what's done by society as a whole. If the CSOs don't put governors under a lot of pressure as you are putting the federal, because there's always a huge focus on the federal. But sometimes we have to also understand the states have budgeted 15.9 trillion this year, vis-a-vis the government budget of about 28.7 trillion. But that 15.9 trillion, we must also think about where is it going, what's it doing in society. So, but I want to assure you, the president is an auditor by profession, an accountant. I'm an accountant as well. We have people in government, in the financial sector, Mr. Waleadu, Mr. Cardoso. These guys are very, strict people who are all about accountability. And I think that whereas in the beginning, we've seen a choppy beginning, but I think that we're going to stabilize in good time. And in fact, if you look at, I'm also in the committee that was set up for fiscal reforms and tax, the one headed by Taiwo Yedele. And one of the things we realized very quickly was that about 50% of the revenues of this country was going into people's pockets, one way or the other. Either some guys have considered themselves into authorities or principalities and power, or like Mr. Rafsanjani said, they, sometimes the case of people giving waivers when they shouldn't. And then we have this feat of taxes sometimes 70 different taxes, which we're trying to narrow into a single digit, so that people don't get, riled by having to pay so many things.
Dr. Fashaw,
but
let me
the
interrupt
digitalization
you,
will be much, much better.
because I understand that the report from the committee is still going to be made public soon enough,
Absolutely.
right? We're waiting
Some
to
of it
see
has
what
been.
comes out of it.
Yes.
And we have been seeing some engagement from Mr. Edele. But as we wrap up, right, and I want to get final thoughts from both of you. I want to bring us back to the conversation, right? It's a conversation around how we pivot. What do we do differently? And one of the things that's been identified as an impediment to economic growth, this isn't just in Nigeria, it's also around how politics and identity politics play into conversations. So Ms. Tayo, in your final thoughts, I'd like you to consider that and just share with us what's on your mind.
Identity politics comes more into play when resources are scarce, right? That's the theory of it. When there is competition for resources, people will divide into as minute fragments as they can. Even if we look exactly alike, if we have to compete for something, we'll find a way to separate ourselves or to distinguish ourselves. So again, it goes back to making things more bountiful. It goes back to making the economy, more robust, so that there's not as much of a fight for some of those things. I think it's a bit of a tricky one because it goes back to the question of nation building and the fact that we've not been able to really successfully do that for a long time now. And to an extent, it even feels like we're going backwards a little bit. But then I think that it goes hand in hand with the economic developments that we're seeking to achieve, and maybe something needs to be done also within the educational curriculum. So perhaps we're not doing enough there in trying to create a national identity that does not again get retarded back to the regional ones. But then in my own closing remarks, I'd like to say something. We've taken bitter pills last year in terms of the fiscal reforms with the removal of the petrol subsidy and in terms of the unification of the exchange rates. For the petrol subsidy, it's already been done, but then there's an opportunity there to move to renewables, or to make sure that renewables are more accessible to Nigerians, whether it's at the SME level or even at the household level. And that looks different depending on what you're talking about. So whether it's about home-based renewable products, like not even a solar system for your entire house, because that's very expensive, but maybe like, the small items that you can actually use. And for the SMEs, you're talking about barbers or salons that we're using the small gens, and now it's much more expensive for them to do that. So there are solar kiosks. So it's an opportunity for us to push energy transition. And then finally, for the other side, which is the forex reforms, now it means that Nigerian exports are supposed to be cheap. So we're supposed to be exporting a lot more because now people can buy our goods relatively cheap. But that is not happening yet. So we should use that also as an opportunity to grow our export. I mean, when you say grow our exports, it sounds very grand and, very difficult. But then there's an opportunity there. If your currency is weak, one of the advantages is that your exports are cheap and imports are expensive. So how can we leverage on these things that feel like challenges and turn them into opportunities? So those are some of the big questions that can help us pivot. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tayo, for your thoughts. Dr. Fashaw, you look quite pensive. So we've got about a minute. What's on your mind?
Within a minute, I probably want to start by saying that one thing that needs to happen in the next now up to 1 year is students who want to study abroad should consider studying locally, because it's crazy. A lot of Nigerian students are stranded, and many of them are complaining. Now they wanted to go, now the thing is looking a lot. And that's sometimes the idea behind devaluation of currencies and depreciation of currencies, to say, okay, things, because one of the things we import the most is education. We spend about, this year we had spent, between 6 months, we had spent about $600 million paying school fees. And we're not talking about what do they call it? Keeping themselves, people, your money you send for self-keeping or whatever it is, abroad paying rent and what have you. So that industry alone is about $2.5 to $3 billion every year. Okay, apart from health, health, tourism, people having to take care of serious health issues abroad, add another $2 billion. Now it's going to be a lot more expensive, meaning that we need to focus home. Now, in terms of exports abroad, we actually are having a boom. There's a company in Lagos, which I may not mention because they're not paying you for advert. But I read in the newspaper how they were pushing a lot of products now up to Mali, because all of a sudden the CFA is a lot more expensive than Nigeria's currency. So and then I just came out of Kano. I told you And, in the Nigeria border, what's going on now is that our maize, our corn, is being bought for cheap. And a lot of these crops are not being supplied
by the way, should not see any trade going through at the moment.
Indeed, but a lot of that so all of this is happening. And however, so I want us to focus on the opportunities that, in spite of the fact that we're being pushed to the wall, so to speak, but there are also opportunities, and there's also a time for us to kind of balance our taste and say, let us see if some of the things we've been used to, we can actually do without some of them for now. But it's all for the good of the country.
Thank you, Dr. Fashua, and I do appreciate your time. My guest, Dr. Tokbayo Fashua, has a PhD in public policy and is also a special advisor to the President on economic matters, also Tenure Lataya, trade and policy development analyst and expert, speaking to me on this conversation. A big thank you as well to our audience for joining us. Just a quick recap. In today's conversation, we've discussed the importance of infrastructure development and how that should be prioritized. We've also discussed national revenue, which we should see improve when people's earning power improves, buying and selling. Formal taxation will only be effective when there's trust in the social contract between the people and the government. Distribution of wealth, redistribution in terms of spatial and economic distribution needs to be done in terms of investment and not handing out palliatives. This is a moment where I take an apology to our viewers who may have missed the beginning of the conversation, but there'll be a repeat broadcast at 5 p.m. tomorrow. And that's this month's edition of Pivotal. Join me next month on the 28th of February as I discuss with another set of Nigerians implementing unconventional ideas that have the power to change our country for the better. I'm Nabila Usman. Good night.